There are moments that destroy a person's future forever, and most of them don't begin with shouting, violence, or flashing headlines. Sometimes they begin with silence. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, inside one of the busiest retail stores in America, a 78-year-old woman quietly unclipped the name badge she had worn for nearly 4 decades and placed it on the manager's desk. Around her, cash registers continued ringing. Shopping carts rolled across polished floors, and customers walked by without realizing they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would soon spread far beyond those automatic glass doors. The young employees avoided looking at her. Some felt sorry for her, while others believed they were watching the inevitable end of someone who had simply become too old to keep up. The manager folded his arms with the confidence of a man convinced he had just made the easiest decision of his career. He expected tears. He expected pleading. He expected anger. Instead, the elderly woman looked directly into his eyes, smiled gently, and spoke only 7 words that left everyone in the room confused. "You'll regret this before the sun goes down." A few employees laughed under their breath. One cashier shook her head, assuming the old woman was simply trying to save what little dignity she had left. The manager smirked and motioned toward the security guard standing near the office door. Without another word, she picked up her purse and slowly walked through the store she had helped build one customer at a time. She didn't glance back at the coworkers she had trained years earlier. She didn't complain about the decision. She didn't ask anyone to explain why 40 years of loyalty had suddenly become meaningless. As the automatic doors slid open, a warm afternoon breeze greeted her. She reached into her worn leather purse and removed an old flip phone that looked as though it belonged in another generation. She pressed a single number from memory, waited only a few seconds, and when someone answered, she calmly said, "It's done." Then she closed the phone, slipped it back into her purse, and sat quietly on a nearby bench as if she had all the time in the world. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Inside the store, the manager congratulated himself for making what he called a necessary business decision. Employees returned to stocking shelves, helping customers, and preparing for another routine afternoon. Then everything changed. One black luxury SUV pulled into the parking lot. Moments later, another arrived. Then another. Executives in tailored suits stepped out one after another, followed by company attorneys and members of the corporate leadership team who almost never visited local stores without weeks of advance notice. Conversations stopped. Customers turned their heads. Employees exchanged nervous glances. The same manager who had laughed only minutes earlier suddenly found himself staring through the front windows with a face drained of every ounce of confidence. Nobody understood why the highest-ranking people in the company would appear without warning at a neighborhood store in the middle of the day. Nobody except the woman sitting quietly outside. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because what happened next would expose a secret that had remained hidden for decades, proving that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding the greatest power. And that one careless decision can erase an entire career before the sun ever has a chance to set. The store where all of this unfolded was one of the busiest locations belonging to one of America's largest retail chains, a company that proudly advertised family values, loyalty, and respect for every customer who walked through its doors. Millions of Americans shopped at stores like this every week without ever thinking about the people who opened the doors before sunrise or stayed long after closing to make sure every shelf was stocked for the next day. Among those employees, one name quietly stood above the rest. Everyone simply knew her as Margaret Lewis. She had been part of that store for nearly 40 years, long before many of her younger coworkers had even been born. She had trained supervisors, welcomed new hires, comforted frightened first-day employees, and watched generations of customers grow from children into parents bringing in children of their own. Her attendance record was almost impossible to believe. She had never missed a scheduled shift without good reason. She had never received a formal complaint from a customer. Her personnel file was filled with letters praising her kindness, patience, and willingness to help others. Customers often adjusted their shopping schedules just so they could stop by Margaret's register because they knew she would greet them with a smile, remember their names, and ask about their families as though they were lifelong friends instead of strangers passing through a checkout line. To the people who knew her, Margaret Lewis represented everything the company claimed to stand for. Yet on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, all of those years of dedication appeared to mean absolutely nothing. One signature from a manager who had barely known her for a few months erased nearly 4 decades of faithful service in less than 5 minutes. To everyone watching, Margaret seemed like the easiest employee to replace. She was older. She earned more than many new hires because of her years with the company. The manager convinced himself that replacing her with someone younger would save money and improve efficiency. It sounded like another routine business decision. At least, that's what he believed. What he didn't know was that the woman he had just escorted out of the building had been carrying a secret that almost nobody inside the company knew existed. Why would someone with Margaret Lewis's remarkable record suddenly be dismissed without hesitation? Who answered the brief phone call she made moments after walking outside? Why did the arrival of corporate executives transform a confident manager into a frightened man within minutes? What connection could an elderly cashier possibly have to people at the very top of one of America's largest companies? And most importantly, what truth had Margaret quietly protected for decades without ever asking for recognition? As remarkable as those questions may seem, every answer only uncovers another layer of a story that grows even more extraordinary, revealing that what looked like the end of an old woman's career was actually the beginning of someone else's complete downfall. Long before anyone questioned Margaret Lewis's place inside the company, she had quietly become the heart of the entire store. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise carrying the same worn leather purse and a small notebook filled with reminders about the people around her. While most employees hurried to clock in and begin their shifts, Margaret made time to ask how everyone's families were doing, whether a co-worker's sick father was recovering, or if a new employee's daughter had enjoyed her birthday party the weekend before. Somehow, she remembered details that everyone else forgot. Customers noticed it too. Parents smiled when Margaret greeted their children by name and wished them a happy birthday without ever checking a calendar. Elderly shoppers often chose the longest checkout line simply because they knew Margaret would take a few extra moments to ask about their health or listen to a story they wanted to share. Veterans who rarely spoke about their military service found themselves opening up to her. Single parents struggling to balance work and family left feeling that someone had genuinely cared about their day. To thousands of people, Margaret wasn't simply scanning groceries. She was providing something that had become increasingly difficult to find in a fast-moving world: kindness without expecting anything in return. New hires quickly discovered that if they wanted to learn how the store truly operated, they didn't ask the supervisors. They asked Margaret Lewis. Over the years, she had trained stock clerks, cashiers, department leads, assistant managers, and even several store managers who now held positions far above her own. Many of the people giving orders throughout the building had once stood nervously beside her during their first week, relying on her patience and encouragement to learn the job. Yet despite everything she had contributed, Margaret never sought promotions or recognition. She politely declined management opportunities more than once, telling friends that she preferred helping people directly instead of sitting behind an office desk. To most employees, the explanation seemed simple. They assumed she stayed because she couldn't afford to retire. After all, she drove an aging sedan that had seen better days. She wore inexpensive sweaters that looked years old, carried the same purse season after season, and packed homemade lunches instead of buying food during breaks. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or influence. If anything, she looked like someone carefully stretching every dollar to make ends meet. But there were moments that quietly challenged those assumptions. Every Christmas Eve, just after the store closed, the same black luxury vehicle would pull discreetly into the parking lot. A sharply dressed driver would step out, open the rear passenger door, and wait patiently while Margaret finished saying goodbye to her coworkers. She would thank everyone for another wonderful year, climb into the waiting vehicle, and disappear into the night. Employees occasionally joked that perhaps she had won the lottery years ago or secretly had wealthy relatives somewhere. Others simply shrugged and went home. No one ever asked Margaret about it, and she never offered an explanation. Life continued exactly as it always had until the company appointed a new regional manager to oversee several locations. He was young, highly educated, and determined to make a name for himself before turning 40. His reputation followed him long before he arrived. Executives praised his ability to reduce expenses, improve quarterly numbers, and eliminate what he called unnecessary costs. He believed every business problem could be solved with efficiency reports and financial data. Experience meant very little to him if it wasn't reflected in a spreadsheet. During his first visit to Margaret's store, he spent hours reviewing payroll records instead of speaking with employees. He saw long-serving workers as expensive liabilities rather than valuable assets. When Margaret Lewis's file appeared on his screen, all he noticed was her age, her years of service, and the higher hourly wage she had earned through decades of loyalty. Without taking even a few minutes to learn who she was or why nearly everyone in the building respected her, he quietly reached a conclusion that would change countless lives. In his mind, Margaret Lewis wasn't the foundation of the store. She was simply dead weight, an aging cashier standing in the way of the leaner, younger workforce he imagined would impress corporate leadership. Believing he was making a smart business decision, he marked her name for immediate termination, never realizing that one signature would soon place his own future in far greater danger than hers. The meeting that ended Margaret Lewis's career lasted less than 5 minutes, but its consequences would echo through the company for years. Shortly after lunch, one of the assistant managers quietly approached Margaret and told her that the new regional manager wanted to see her in the office immediately. She smiled politely, finished helping an elderly customer load groceries into a shopping cart, straightened her name tag one last time, and slowly walked toward the back hallway. Several employees noticed where she was going. A strange feeling settled over the store. Nobody could explain it, but conversations became quieter, and more than one coworker found an excuse to pass near the office door. Inside, the regional manager sat behind the desk with a thin folder resting in front of him. He didn't invite Margaret to sit down. He didn't ask how she was doing. He didn't mention the thousands of customers she had served or the generations of employees she had helped train. He never acknowledged the nearly 40 years she had devoted to the company. As far as he was concerned, none of that mattered anymore. Without looking away from the paperwork, he informed her that her employment was being terminated effective immediately. Margaret listened without interrupting. She waited for an explanation, hoping there had been some misunderstanding. Instead, the regional manager leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone convinced he was making a bold leadership decision. "The company needs younger energy," he said. "We're moving in a different direction, and it's time to make room for people who can keep up with today's business." Those words seemed to hang in the air long after he finished speaking. Outside the office, several employees froze where they stood. They couldn't believe what they had just heard. Some lowered their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged nervous glances, afraid that if someone as respected as Margaret Lewis could be dismissed so easily, no one's job was truly secure. The regional manager expected resistance. He assumed Margaret would remind him of her years of service, argue that the decision was unfair, or ask for another chance. Instead, she remained remarkably calm. There wasn't a trace of anger in her voice or bitterness on her face. With slow, steady hands, she unclipped the employee badge she had worn for almost 4 decades and gently placed it on the desk between them. Then she looked directly into the regional manager's eyes with a quiet confidence that made even he hesitate for a brief moment. "You just made the most expensive mistake of your career," she said softly. The room fell completely silent. For a second, neither of them moved. Then the regional manager let out a short laugh, shaking his head as though he had just heard an empty threat from someone unwilling to accept reality. He told her she was free to believe whatever she wanted, but the decision was final. Reaching for the phone on his desk, he called security and instructed them to escort Margaret Lewis from the building. When the security officer arrived, Margaret thanked him with the same kindness she showed everyone else, picked up her worn leather purse, and walked toward the front entrance without once looking back. Employees silently stepped aside as she passed. Some wanted to speak, but the words never came. Others watched with tears in their eyes, believing they had just witnessed the heartbreaking end of a remarkable career. As the automatic doors closed behind her, the regional manager returned to his paperwork, convinced the matter was finished and that he had just eliminated another unnecessary expense. Around the store, employees slowly resumed their work, telling themselves life would go on as usual. None of them realized that Margaret's departure wasn't the end of the story. It was the exact moment another story had already begun, one that would soon turn the regional manager's greatest display of confidence into the greatest humiliation of his entire professional life. Margaret Lewis stepped through the automatic doors for what everyone believed would be the last time. The afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk, shoppers continued filling their carts, and traffic flowed past the parking lot as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside the store, the regional manager was already discussing staffing changes with department supervisors, confident that he had made a decisive business move that would earn praise from corporate leadership. Outside, however, Margaret showed no sign of disappointment. She walked to a small wooden bench near the edge of the parking lot, carefully sat down, and rested her worn leather purse beside her. Anyone watching from a distance would have assumed she was simply gathering herself before calling a family member for a ride home. Instead, she opened her purse, removed the same aging flip phone that several employees had noticed over the years, and slowly entered a number she clearly knew by heart. She held the phone to her ear for only a few seconds. When the person on the other end answered, Margaret spoke just 4 quiet words. "I think it's time." There was no lengthy explanation, no emotion in her voice, no request for help. She closed the phone, returned it to her purse, folded her hands in her lap, and waited with the patience of someone who already knew exactly what would happen next. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Inside the store, employees tried to return to their normal routines, although the mood had changed completely. Some couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's final words inside the office. Others wondered whether they should have spoken up when she was dismissed. The regional manager, meanwhile, believed the tension would disappear by the end of the afternoon. He couldn't have been more mistaken. Nearly 20 minutes after Margaret made her call, the first black luxury SUV turned into the parking lot. Employees standing near the front windows noticed it immediately. Before anyone had time to speculate, a second SUV pulled in behind it, followed by a third. Men and women in tailored business suits stepped out with remarkable urgency, moving toward the entrance without exchanging casual conversation. Their expressions were serious. Their pace was deliberate. The atmosphere inside the store changed in an instant. Customers stopped pushing their shopping carts. Cashiers looked toward the front doors. Department supervisors exchanged confused glances, trying to identify the unexpected visitors. Then another vehicle arrived, and the person who stepped out caused the entire management team to freeze. It was the company's chief executive officer, a leader so rarely seen in local stores that many employees recognized him only from annual company broadcasts. Walking just behind him were members of the corporate legal department, senior executives from human resources, and several board representatives. They hadn't scheduled a visit. They hadn't announced an inspection. They had arrived without warning, and judging by the expressions on their faces, this wasn't a courtesy call. The regional manager hurried toward the entrance, forcing a smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Moments earlier, he had carried himself with complete confidence. Now his hands trembled slightly as he greeted executives who ignored his attempts at friendly conversation and continued walking deeper into the building. Nobody inside the store could understand why the highest-ranking leaders of one of America's largest retail companies would interrupt their schedules to visit a single location because one elderly cashier had been fired. The answer reached back almost 40 years, to a time when the company existed only as a handful of stores struggling to survive against much larger competitors. Long before millions of Americans knew the company's name, Margaret Lewis had stood beside its founder during its earliest and most difficult years. She wasn't an executive or an investor. She wasn't interested in titles or recognition. She believed every customer deserved respect, every employee deserved kindness, and every honest day's work deserved appreciation. While others chased promotions, Margaret chose to remain where she believed she could make the greatest difference, serving people face to face. The company's founder never forgot that decision. As the business expanded across the country and success transformed it into one of America's retail giants, he repeatedly offered Margaret opportunities to move into corporate leadership. Each time, she politely declined, explaining that the company's greatest strength would never be found inside boardrooms, but in the way ordinary employees treated ordinary people every single day. Her humility earned something far more valuable than a promotion. It earned the founder's complete trust. Before retiring, he left one standing instruction with the board of directors, the chief executive officer, and every future leader entrusted with protecting the company's values. His words were simple and unforgettable. "If anyone ever disrespects Margaret Lewis, I want to know immediately." Those instructions had remained quietly preserved for years, known only to a small circle of senior leadership. The regional manager had never heard them. He never bothered to learn the history of the people working beneath him. The phone call Margaret made from the bench hadn't been a plea for justice or an emotional complaint. It was simply the fulfillment of a promise made decades earlier. The person who answered her call possessed the authority to protect the founder's final request, and with that single sentence, Margaret had unknowingly begun a chain of events that would end far more than one manager's career. The moment the chief executive officer entered the building, the atmosphere changed from confusion to quiet panic. The regional manager attempted to explain the situation before anyone asked a single question, insisting that he had simply made a difficult business decision in the best interests of the company. The executives listened without interrupting, but their expressions revealed nothing. Instead of accepting his explanation, they instructed him to surrender his office keys, remain available for questioning, and refrain from contacting anyone until the review was complete. For the first time that afternoon, the confidence that had carried him through Margaret Lewis's termination began to disappear. The corporate legal team immediately requested security footage from every camera covering the office, the sales floor, and the entrance. Human resources began interviewing employees one by one, asking each person to describe exactly what they had seen and heard. Cashiers, department supervisors, stock associates, and security officers all repeated the same story. Margaret had been respectful from beginning to end. She had never argued. She had never raised her voice. She had accepted the decision with dignity, while the regional manager dismissed nearly 40 years of service with a single sentence about needing younger energy. As investigators continued their review, another picture began to emerge, one that had nothing to do with Margaret alone. Records from several stores under the regional manager's supervision revealed a troubling pattern. Experienced employees over the age of 60 had quietly disappeared from payroll records at an unusually high rate. Exit interviews had been altered or left incomplete. Complaints about disrespectful treatment had never reached corporate headquarters because they had been closed before anyone outside his office could review them. Productivity reports had been manipulated to make his staffing decisions appear more successful than they really were. Managers who questioned his methods found themselves transferred or excluded from important meetings. What had first appeared to be one unfortunate decision quickly became evidence of a leadership style that ignored the very principles upon which the company had built its reputation. By early evening, the investigation had produced enough evidence for the board to act immediately. The regional manager was informed that his employment had been terminated effective that day. A promotion that had already been approved for the following quarter was permanently withdrawn. Every recommendation attached to his personnel file was suspended pending further review, and word of the internal investigation soon reached executives throughout the retail industry. In a profession where trust and integrity often determine future opportunities, the damage to his reputation spread far beyond a single company. Employees watched in stunned silence as the same man who had confidently escorted Margaret Lewis out of the building only hours earlier was himself asked to leave under the supervision of corporate security. There was no applause, no celebration, only the quiet realization that respect cannot be measured by job titles or quarterly reports. Once the investigation concluded, the chief executive officer walked outside to the bench where Margaret still sat peacefully waiting. He thanked her personally for honoring the promise she had made to the company's founder decades earlier and asked if she would return inside. As Margaret entered the store, something remarkable happened. Employees slowly stepped away from their registers, departments, and workstations until they formed a line stretching across the front of the building. One after another, they began applauding. Some smiled through tears. Others lowered their heads, embarrassed that they had never taken the time to ask about the woman who had quietly mentored so many of them over the years. The standing ovation continued for several long moments, but Margaret appeared almost uncomfortable with the attention. Recognition had never been what motivated her. The chief executive officer then asked if there was anything the company could do to repay her for everything she had given over the past 4 decades. Those listening expected her to ask for retirement benefits, a financial reward, or perhaps a senior leadership position that reflected her extraordinary contribution. Instead, Margaret Lewis offered a request so simple that it left the entire room silent once again. She said that no employee, regardless of age, position, or background, should ever be made to feel that years of honest service could be erased without dignity or gratitude. She asked the company to remember that every person wearing its name badge deserved to be treated with respect because every role mattered. The board accepted her request immediately. In the months that followed, new leadership standards were introduced across every location in the country. Mandatory training emphasized respectful workplace practices, stronger protections were created for long-serving employees, and termination procedures were rewritten to ensure that every decision reflected the company's founding values. Margaret Lewis never claimed credit for those changes. She simply returned to living the quiet life she had always preferred, content in knowing that one moment of courage had protected countless employees she would never even meet. In the end, the story of Margaret Lewis was never truly about a job, a termination letter, or even one manager's downfall. It was about something much deeper. It was about the people who spend decades showing up, doing their best, and making a difference in ways that are often overlooked. Margaret walked through those store doors every morning without expecting applause, recognition, or special treatment. She simply believed that how you treat people matters, even when nobody important is watching. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room carries the greatest influence. The person everyone ignores may be the person who has changed the most lives. The person who never asks for attention may be the one whose actions are remembered long after titles disappear. The regional manager believed he was removing an old employee who no longer belonged in the future of the company. He believed Margaret Lewis was just another name on a payroll report, just another expense to reduce, just another person who could be replaced. But he was wrong. He wasn't simply firing an employee. He was challenging the very values that had helped build the company from the beginning. He was disrespecting the person who had spent decades protecting those values when nobody else was paying attention. And in the end, Margaret Lewis didn't need revenge. She didn't need to destroy him. She didn't need to prove her importance. The truth did that for her. One phone call revealed everything. One decision exposed a pattern. And one moment of disrespect changed the future of an entire company. Because power can disappear overnight. Positions can be taken away. Promotions can vanish. But character, kindness, and the way someone treats others will always leave a lasting mark. The manager thought he was ending Margaret Lewis's career. Instead, he created the moment that reminded everyone why she mattered. If you witnessed someone being treated like Margaret, would you have spoken up or stayed silent? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more unforgettable stories every week.